Ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to say this was the penultimate episode, but I think we have a surprise guest coming late December, mid-December, if you don't account for the last 2 weeks of the year, who's going to talk to us a little bit about some portfolio operations. Yeah. Okay, this episode, we're talking about you have a plan and you need to make a plan to execute this plan. So double plans. And what I mean by that is essentially, I think you and I have been kind of belaboring the idea that when you make a plan, that thing you have on paper is probably not going to be exactly what happens. And so you're advising folks about how to deal with the execution of this plan. And so that's what we're going to talk about today is like, what happens once you have your plan built? How do you go about executing this plan, and what's your strategy for execution? Regardless of how accurate you've been or how much your plan change rate is kind of reduced, you still need a plan of execution. So that's what we're talking about today. Like, what are you doing with your customers to get them ready to execute these plans that we're building in Q4 of this year for 2026? What are you doing to get them prepared?
Yeah, I think it's I'd argue it's the most important step, right? You can have the best plan in the world, but if you don't implement that and then monitor the implementation, then it's going to fall apart and you're not going to hit the results that you anticipated. And you often see with people that are not doing this well is that by the time they get to the end of the quarter or maybe the end of Q2 or Q3, that's when they realize that they're off track. They see that the burn down charts are not kind of tracking to goal. The headcount cost is above expectation. Time to fill is not hitting. The org chart is completely messed up. I think the importance of this cannot be understated. I feel quite passionately about this. I'm an ops guy. I'm an operator, from military, supply chain to talent, and this is where I've come from. And so what I generally like to see at kind of this point is, okay, we've got the plan in place. Who does what and by when, and then what are the metrics that we're tracking to make sure that we're on target? And so, as simple as, okay, let's just pull headcount once a month and just see, okay, given what happened over the last month, how many did we hire? How many left? Was that above or below expectation? And does that actually change the plan that we put in place? And so, if you're ramping up your sales team because you're trying to capture more revenue, and your attrition rate goes up on that sales team, if you stick to the plan that you made in December, and by the end of January you're now kind of 5 reps below target, then you're never going to hit that quota. And so it's at this point that you need to start making adjustments. And the earlier in the year that you make that adjustment, the more time that the headcount system has to react, so that you can actually get back on track much sooner. And that really feeds into recruiting, because generally recruiting is the last to know when these kind of huge swings happen. And so it's really about, how do you connect the dots between the business, the recruiting function, the HR team, onboarding, the finance team who are actually putting in all the budget, and kind of get everyone on the same page so that everyone's looking at the same plan and you can actually make quick decisions when the data shows that you're off track. So that's generally what I see working with clients, and from my own experience as well. I'm curious if you've seen the same thing working with people at Headcount 365, and as people have onboarded the platform, have they seen that kind of benefit of actually moving to a more kind of real-time view of what's happening with headcount?
So I think the biggest takeaway about the plan for the plan is the headcount plan that you create, this forecast of what people are needed to fulfill some level of demand, has a higher level input, which is the business forecast. And I'll give you an example from Uber. So at Uber, if we went to launch a city, we have a headcount plan of, we need a general manager, we called it DOps, driver operations, and a MM, marketing manager. So those were the 3 that would launch a city. And we would forecast that we're going to launch all of these cities. And if for some reason a regulation, this is very early Uber, by the way, but if for some reason a regulation came or there was a issue and we couldn't launch that city, those headcount were no longer needed. So that idea, that was very fast paced, and we kind of got that feedback live. It was an amazing lesson to learn at the time. But if you're a business that is planning to do something, whether it's make a sale, expand an account, launch a location, and that does or does not happen, or it happens to a different degree, or you get faster adoption, that's what changes your headcount plan. And so having an idea over the course of a year what people you need to fulfill what demand is dependent on the demand. So you have that demand aspect first. And so this idea for having a plan is really about first listening to the business forecast and saying, what is the probability that we think these things would happen? And so some of our customers, they have interesting ways of going about solving this problem. Some folks will say we have a 50% probability of signing this deal, so we're going to hire 50% of the headcount. And if we don't sign it, then we'll just apply those headcount somewhere else. Some folks will wait until the deal is signed and then hire the headcount after the deal is signed. And then they kind of run into issues with the time to fill, creating like late hires or high priority utilization from super urgent, we just signed this deal, we need people, and it's a little bit more reactive. So there's different styles to do it. But I think the biggest takeaway for making a plan for your plan, I think we should probably think of a better way to say it. The biggest takeaway for making a plan for your plan is knowing the inputs first and kind of keeping your ear to the ground on the bigger business issues. So like, why are these headcount being hired? And if we understand how the changes to that input are going to have variance, then we can adjust the prioritization of those headcount. We could guide our recruiters to focus on different roles, and we'll have a general idea of how those things will shape. And so you already know me. One of the biggest things that I'll do to kind of forecast that is look at what happened the previous couple of years. But that's no real. You can't predict the future based on the past. History rhymes, rarely repeats. So it's like you have to take that information and apply it to what's happening with your business for those new things. Is that something that you're doing with your customers? Are you doing that in your work?
Yeah, it's I think looking at historics is very helpful. Not to kind of use that as the exact plan moving forward, but to actually try and tease out what are the leading indicators that something is going to happen. I think you gave a good example there of kind of a more conservative approach of, okay, hire 50% to capacity. I think that the danger is at that point, if the city launches, you're either 50% under capacity, and so you have to hire the other 50%, which is fine. It actually de-risks it. But if the city doesn't launch and you can't repurpose those 50%, then you're 50% over capacity. And then waiting until launch, we know time to fill, ramp time, even just building a recruiting team takes time. So it's the kind of like time from actually person in seat delivering value, and kind of how do you work backwards from there to when you actually need to take action. And so one of the things that I really like to look for is what are the leading indicators that are going to tell us that we're going to need demand in the future. And this comes from supply chain. Actually, you can kind of like forecast sales, and you can kind of go all the way through to, how much inventory do we need based on expected demand in the coming year based on historic forecasts. But that's even in the military. When you're planning an operation, you don't know all the inputs for the success of the operation beforehand. But what you do know is, okay, at this point in time, we'll have this information, and that's going to give us this much more additional context, which is then going to allow us to set what the kind of the plan of action is going to be. In a headcount perspective, that is, looking at something like hiring a sales team. I think we discussed this before we jumped on live, but if you're hiring a sales team, some companies may just want to go, okay, well, once we hit a certain revenue number, we know we need to then grow to the next revenue number, and then so we'll just divide that additional revenue by quota, and we'll hire that many sales reps. Like we know that's not going to work. You're always going to be lagging behind. You're never going to hit your revenue goals. But what you can start to do is look at, okay, if we're seeing demand for the product go up and we're seeing revenue go up, where is that coming from? It's coming from pipeline, and from pipeline is coming from marketing at the very top of the funnel. And so if you're starting to see more activity at the very top of the funnel, and you have a 6-month sales cycle, you can actually start to tease out advanced notice then that you're going to need additional sales headcount. And then beyond that, you're going to need additional post-sales headcount. And so you can start to kind of model that out in a more dynamic way. And so you can actually start to implement these kind of like trigger points, but you're looking at historics to figure out if we see a spike in top of funnel demand, like how long does that then take before we see demand for our product, and then how can I actually use that to blend together with the hiring cycle? Oh, again, a bit of a monologue, which I feel like I do each time, but I feel that's a really important concept to understand. Like, how do you link together the kind of known entities and the historics that give you that time horizon with the known time it takes to actually take action there, so that you can actually implement the plan, and kind of like stay true to the fiscal year plan that you've put in place at the end of the year, which a lot of people are doing right now.
Just listening to you, the way that you think about it has changed my name. Instead of plan for the plan, it's the execution strategy of headcount. every time I refer to it now, I'm saying the execution strategy of headcount. But I think another key thing about the execution strategy is understanding the dynamic with which you're going to execute that strategy. What I mean by that is the AI world is going to influence how the ratio of people to work, and it will change where you can hire people and what skill sets people have in one location versus another. Enhanced with AI might make a place more cost effective or not. So you're going to have this relationship between technology and people as for let's call it work capacity. You're going to have a change. That's one of the fastest things that's changing now. So this headcount plan, you're going to need a strategy for how AI will change the production level of an individual worker and what's its impact on wage and location and all of the other headcount costs. So that's kind of one thing over here. And that will then in turn impact the job market. So you're going to have a different availability of candidates. I don't know if there's like a national institute of the job market. I know there isn't, but I always hear anecdotally recruiters or recruiting leaders saying like, oh, it's a candidate market, it's a company market, it's a hot market, it's not a hot market, right? So as the work relationship changes with people, so does the availability, the comp expectations, the ability to kind of use the candidate market and its current state within your execution strategy to ensure that you get whatever outcome that you're going for. And so these obviously have second order effects on the candidate and on the hiring manager and on all, there's a lot of different things to consider here. And I'm not going to debate the morality of these types of things. That's just what's going to happen, whether you agree with it or not. Those are the decisions that are happening in each business. And so how does it affect junior hiring? How does it affect the cost of hiring, where you hire, all that type of stuff? To me, those are the things like when I'm building the execution strategy of what it is that I'm trying to do with my headcount plan. I not only am looking at what happened last year and trying to figure out what's happening. I'm not only looking at the plan for this year and what variance I expect. I am taking into account like the environment by which I'm going to execute this headcount strategy and realize that that might have some level of change associated with what I'm doing. And I think that that's something for 2026 that most workforce planners or recruiting leaders are going to have to deal with, because it's going to, without that, the worst traffic is the traffic you don't expect. You know what I mean? Like if you're planning for traffic, you're annoyed, but you're not like late or whatever, right? So, if a recruiting leader goes into next year's plan expecting it to be whatever it's going to be or not changes with this type of reasoning, it may be more frustrating. So like just unifying your expectations around what you think is going to happen, let's call it a prediction, but I think that'll be a trend that I see continue and potentially expand, if this AI bubble doesn't burst.
Yeah, I was actually reading an article, one of the latest from the McKinsey People blog this morning on actually utilizing the impact of AI on the headcount plans moving forward. And I think the big takeaway is most of us don't really know what's going to happen. And so I think planning with any kind of certainty right now is going to be really difficult. I think all we do know is that it is going to change the plan. And so maybe the best plan is to have a agile plan that you can adapt to. And it comes back to everything I think we've been talking about. Like, how can you refresh your data more quickly and stay on top of what's changing in the organization, so that when you do have to make a quick decision, you already have all the inputs there to be able to make it, and you already have the right people in the room to make that decision, and everyone understands the impact to that part of the business, whether it is the business, if it's the sales team or the engineering team or the ops team, or it's talent acquisition or it's HR, and how do they kind of talk together so that when something does change, everyone gets the notification very quickly, and you're not kind of burning resources on hiring people you no longer need, or planning an onboarding program that is going to be completely overhauled because all of a sudden everyone needs to be upskilled in AI. So I think there's a lot of different variables that are at play. And I think the one key takeaway going into 2026 is uncertainty around how that's going to impact the internal headcount environment.
I think you and I are kind of approaching it from like the broader business perspective, right? We're talking about all businesses up to this point in the conversation, and every large scale business kind of needs a North Star to align each individual I want to say user, but let's call it stakeholder, right? So like each individual stakeholder, whether you're a department or a budget owner, whether you're a recruiting person, an HR person, a workforce planner, a finance person, all five of these individual business plans for this headcount strategy execution need to roll up into like one unified strategy. So as we talk about, using history, managing variance, planning for your environment, these are business aspects. But I think for each of those users, there's some level of individual plan that they need to produce or they need to create to prepare for what's coming their way. Right. And so you mentioned something very interesting in like the HR kind of workforce planning zone, right? So if I'm a workforce planner or I'm an HRBP and I see this plan coming and I know that we have this environment that's going to be changing a lot, I want to be prepared for what impacts do I forecast in my zone given different scenarios. So, in a world where I need to upskill people on a new tool, that's training, that's L&D, that's a plan within your workforce to get people from one level of production to another through an investment. So if you're going to have a headcount plan that has one version of investment, but we believe that there'll be a change that produces another level of investment, those are the models that a workforce planner needs to build in order to prepare for those changes that are coming. So like having something for your existing plan, but knowing what might change is kind of one way that a workforce planner is looking at the headcount execution strategy and saying, okay, you're hiring 100 people that all need to do XYZ job. So here's my plan. However, if XYZ, then I might need to hire another L&D person myself. I might need to get my own tool. I might need to prepare for this location, whatever it is, right? A workforce planner, what I'm hearing from you is like they need to have a plan for their plan, and it needs to roll up to this idea of what does the business expect? So I think coming out of building your plan, coming out of this, Q4 area, your business is coming down to each of these stakeholders. We'll get into each of them, but they're coming down to the stakeholders saying, this is what we anticipate to happen based on this forecast. This is the context and confidence we have in that execution. We're going to start Q1, or we might even start now. Everybody, let's go. I need to hear your plans for it. Starting with the workforce planner, that's kind of the first thing that comes to mind after kind of listening to how you think about scenario planning at the AI level. But anything to add on the workforce planner side, or like, what do you think about building an individual plan for any of those other stakeholders?
Yeah, I mean, I don't envy the job of the workforce planner right now going into next year, because it used to be you pretty much had one lever, right? If there's increased demand from the business, you can increase your total headcount. If there's decrease, you decrease headcount. And that's where, boom and bust hiring and layoffs come from. I think right now you're seeing if there's an increased demand from the business, the question is, do we need more headcount, or do we need to rescale the headcount we have, or do we need more tools, or is there a way to restructure the organization to be more cost effective to deliver the same or greater output? Another post I read this week was showing how the kind of M7 companies have kept headcount stable or even reduced headcount, but increased their annual revenue by 40 to 60%. And so you're actually seeing the big companies start to do this now with efficiency savings. And there's an argument of, are they actually kind of making the current employees work harder and getting more out of the current employees because of the macro environment that we're in, or is it more kind of technology driven? But I think a lot of board members, a lot of CEOs are going to be asking now, do we actually need this head, or is there another way for us to optimize our headcount plan? And if you're the workforce planner and trying to answer those questions, when we don't really have any solid data on the effectiveness of a lot of these tools, kind of how can you answer that question reliably? Actually, I have some opinions about how you can maybe adopt more of like a test and evaluate approach, but realistically, they're going to need to provide answers now, and they're not going to see the results of the recommendations they make for 6, 9, 12 months down the road. Are you seeing that with the kind of customers that you're working with right now?
So what I'm seeing with the workforce planning shift is that there's the individual. So there's a few things, right? There's the individual number of heads and what they're associated to as it relates to demand. But then there's also the structure of those heads. So if you're going to be changing, when you build a headcount plan and you're building ICs, you have the IC to manager or IC to enablement ratios that are like, okay, for every 10 sellers, I need one manager and maybe a sales ops person or whatever, right? So if you're going to be changing the dynamics through an efficiency gain from AI, then you're going to essentially change the makeup of your organization. So there needs to be some sort of dynamic planning to the org structure as well, so that you don't make these ad hoc changes to account for a change in efficiency strategy or a new tool release or whatever, and then you end up with like an imbalanced org as it relates to a management structure and or a comp structure. So I think a workforce planner needs to be looking at, and I would say that this kind of combines with the HRBP as well. So that's kind of a HR in general, is you're looking at how does the demand and our ability to meet that demand with our existing or net new workforce, how does that relationship then impact the org structure, the comp, the leveling, the promotion tracks. There's just a lot to think about when you're going to take something as disruptive as AI and apply it to a headcount plan where you might see a reduction from your existing plan. And so I think it all goes back to like having a general idea of like what your company's philosophy is on this adoption and how fast you're willing to move. Some companies are going to drag their feet a little bit to test for their individual customer set or sales cycle, whatever. But that individual company, right, on one end of the spectrum, you're going to have super adopters of AI. On the other end, you're going to have late adopters or not adopting at all. And the same workforce planner can work at both of those companies, and they just need to be able to adapt to that kind of condition and philosophy of the business. So, we're not there yet. I haven't like had too many conversations. Like we do a quarterly QBR with our customers to try to talk about the relationship of capacity demand and what we see happening financially so that they can extract the data from our system. And we're not yet having this conversation of like, oh, this person hired, I thought you were going to add 50 ICs to this group. You actually hired 3 or 4 producers plus AI tools. We haven't seen it yet, but I would say like I said, if the AI thing if it's not a bubble to be burst, right, then this is a trend. That's obviously what they're optimizing for. They're optimizing to maximize the productivity of an individual, and it's going to change the structure of who you hire because those entry-level tasks, entry-level not being, I would say the IC tasks, are meant to be consolidated in a way that's repeatable with this replacement IC. So from a workforce planning standpoint, my customers are experiencing the AI change. They're all driving towards it. I think there's a lot of excitement to it, but we're not having that conversation yet. But I am talking about preparing for that conversation in the future.
I think that there's like a point you touched on there that I think is worth highlighting, the kind of dynamic org chart and the impact that has on the adoption of these kind of tools. And I think from the business perspective, I think what a lot of leaders will need to start doing is actually looking at how these changes change their overall org chart structure and what is the risk to their organization because of that. And so I think one of the trends that we're seeing is more ICs and fewer managers. Which is maybe overdue in some organizations. But then what's going to happen is you're going to have the kind of like the spans and layers become a little out of whack. And your kind of critical points then become these managers who are the key nodes between kind of a whole army of individual contributors and the kind of overall strategy of the business. And all of a sudden, these kind of individuals become overloaded and maybe leave to go somewhere else, especially if the market comes back and all of a sudden hiring is now a very, very much a candidates market. Then what is the organization going to do? And so I think that the business leaders need to understand the risk to the organization of all these changes. That needs to be communicated effectively to the HRBPs so that they're advising their leaders on what these kind of changes are going to mean and how they could maybe de-risk slightly. We used to have kind of complex of, a triplex redundancy system, which means you never have one single point of failure in a kind of an engineering system. You always want at least 2, but preferably 3. So if you lose one of the systems, you actually have a backup. And so actually starting to think through, okay, if we're going to save headcount costs because we're going to introduce more automation, that means that each headcount that we have becomes more critical. And so how do we then kind of share risk across the organization so that if we lose one person, it doesn't actually blow up the whole org and we lose 6 months worth of revenue because we had a sales manager who was driving results and all of a sudden they got hired by OpenAI.
Agreed. Yeah, I think what you're getting to is there's a financial impact to all of these decisions. So you start with the business strategy. We covered workforce planners. I think if you're an FP&A person, you need a plan for plan execution as well. And there's an overarching financial philosophy that I've seen that's kind of, there's this, there's 2 types, some dichotomy of financial strategy as it relates to headcount. One is that the finance team and the business have a transparency layer where what they've given to the business is actually what the finance team is going to forecast and report on. And the other one is finance kind of keeps this budget to the side and releases the budget to the team, and they manage to their own budget, right? So I've seen kind of both styles, and they have their pros and cons. And there's obviously as you get more enterprise, you lean one way than the other. But those are kind of like the styles with which that you can uh, execute your headcount plan. And then secondly, I've also seen pre Headcount 365, the idea of like slush fund management to account for the variance that might happen in plan execution. There's just a bucket of money that sits. Now, our goal at Headcount 365 is to release as much of that money as possible, because it's just sitting there and you might earn interest on it, but you're not necessarily earning an ROI on it, especially for scaling companies. But if you're a finance person, you're an FP&A business partner, and you have this plan out there, you are then responsible for reporting the financial performance of these headcount against what your target is. And so you're going to need a lot more information about how these changes happen, and then have an idea of, okay, well, now that these changes have happened, what's the impact to the forecast? And so there's different plans that you need to have as far as how do you receive the data from the business? What does it mean for your plan? And you know, you're going to have a measured outcome for your plan today. So assuming this whole AI thing that we were talking about doesn't come to fruition, if the business hires the headcount that we have today, did we get the financial, if the plan comes 100% true, did we get the outcome that we were expecting? And even today, some companies, the answer is no, right? They overestimated, and then the business didn't hire, but they still hit their goals. So did we really need all those extra headcount, or were they just nice to have? And so you're going to have that's like, let's call that the base. And then you're going to add in all this variance of, okay, how does the market dynamics, how does change in AI, change in comp, change in business structure, regulation, how are all those things going to impact my financials? And then I need to make a plan for that as well. So for an FP&A business partner, they're responsible for tracking what the cost and impact is of the decisions that you make in headcount. And so having a plan for extracting that information and managing the approval of changes, and then reporting on whether or not those changes helped you perform better or worse to plan, is kind of that's the structure of what an FP&A business partner is doing during this period of Q4, where, okay, we have this plan, we know we're going to execute next year. I need to set myself up for success for 2026.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the advantages of actually having an analytics capability in the organization is it's quite easy to say, we spent this on this project and this was the result. What you can't really say, unless you actually go deep and actually understand at the unit level, had we spent this, this would have been the result. Had we not spent this would have been the result. And to actually capture the true ROI of a project, whether that's increasing headcount, onboarding a new tool, restructuring an organization, investing in marketing and ad spend, you need to understand the kind of baseline effectively in order to understand whether that project actually paid off. I think too often we just see a very simplistic analysis and say, we spent $50,000 on an employer brand marketing campaign, and we increased kind of recruiting throughput by 50%, and so that actually lowered our cost per hire overall because it took less time to hire all our roles. But what you don't account for is, had we not spent that, we maybe would have even increased it even further. It's just we had to dedicate part of our resource to managing this new kind of vendor. So there's kind of like a lot of analysis that I think needs to go on kind of below the surface in order to help finance understand the impact of these kind of projects. And I'm talking from vast experience here. I've spent a lot of time actually looking through line by line at the numbers and kind of understanding what's actually working, what's not working. And I think having that line by line analysis of exactly the return that you're getting from a new platform is really helpful, because then you can actually start to double down on the things that are really working and actually cut away the things that aren't working. So you simplify everything. And kind of going back to, actually how do you implement the plan in the business? It's almost all change management. And there's only so much change management you can do at one time. There's only so much training resources you can allocate. If you're focusing on the things that are actually important and actually work, then you can avoid the things that don't, and you actually get the biggest ROI for the overall team if you follow through on that.
Yeah, I think when you're an FP&A business partner and you're building your plan for next year, yeah, the cost of recruiting or the cost of execution is going to have some level of impact on the budget. And so if you're a recruiting leader who's been in the conversation or not, the conversation is happening. Sometimes there's executive searches. Sometimes there's confidential searches. Sometimes there's going to be spikes in demand that require, RPOs or some flash growth of headcount. It's not just all internal heads. And so the cost of recruiting is something that fluctuates with the business demand. We have a baseline of what we plan for. And so all recruiting costs divided by total hire is fine. But as the business fluctuates and kind of does what it does, requires things of recruiting, you're going to incur costs. And so from a recruiting leader's perspective, as you partner with FP&A, if you're able to get into that conversation, that's a credibility builder because you're able to then align with the financial goals and you're going to get more information from the FP&A team if you're able to speak their language. And so one, cost of hire and understanding what your team costs. Everything that recruiting costs is a line item on an FP&A budget. I'm simplifying, but there's a cost of internal recruiting, and then there's a cost of expanding internal recruiting and a cost of expanding external recruiting depending on the needs. And so if you can get in that conversation, that is one part of a recruiting leader's, headcount plan execution that is, kind of critical is partnering with the finance team for things like external hiring or expanding your internal team. What other things are recruiting leaders need in their headcount plan execution from your perspective, other than just aligning with finance?
Yeah, I think when you come back to talking to the business, and we hinted at it briefly with the kind of like risk profiling that the business leaders will need to do, it's understanding the prioritization and the sequencing of those kind of hires. So generally, you probably want to build a team top down so that you're not having senior directors managing very junior employees. You want the manager of the team to be involved in the hiring process, but often the management layer hire takes much longer. And so understanding the sequencing and saying, okay, if you have a 6 months time to hire for a senior manager and a 3 months time to hire for the analysts that are going to build on that team, that's not a 6 month time to fill for that team. That's 9 months. Because you can't really start hiring the analysts until the manager's in place. And so I think understanding that sequencing and making sure that your recruiting team's not burning resources on things that are actually going to have to wait and kind of reprioritizing, but then understanding if there is a urgent need to backfill someone, that's going to put these things on hold. And so how do you kind of rapidly reprioritize and have the agile recruiting capacity to be able to kind of support the changing needs of the business, which are probably going to change more frequently in 2026 than in previous years because of all the change that's coming moving forward. Another role I don't envy right now is head of TA roles, where you're kind of managing to this kind of crazy environment that is kind of always changing with a team that's going to be asked to do much more with much less, even more so than in the last 12 months. And I think that this is where upskilling on the right tools and understanding how you can actually get the data in order to be more well armed going into these conversations is going to be really effective.
Yeah, I think if you're a TA leader, you need to be aligned with your finance team about what your cost strategy is for team expansion. And that's based on kind of headcount demand changes, right? Then you need a way for people to process those changes. So how does someone request? How do they get approved? How do you know when it's time for you to change the headcount plan? It's not just your decision and the hiring manager. There's other people that need to be involved. So you need an approval strategy. You also need a capacity demand forecast. So you've asked me certain things by certain dates, and I have linear recruiting capacity. And so if you're asking me for everything January, February, March, I need to make a different plan than if those same roles were spread all across the whole year. Right. So then you need a prioritization plan. So how do managers know what high priority is? And is high priority mean the same thing to everybody? And is it aligned across the business? So a prioritization plan that allows you to say, these are what the business priorities are. It's a subset of our total recruiting capacity or a subset of the total demand that's actively being recruited now. It's like, these are the things that I need to do to ensure that prioritization works across the business. And then lastly, you need a management strategy. So how are you going to direct your team to execute this demand? So as a TA leader, when you're building your plan for what the headcount plan execution strategy is, you're taking in consideration, I need to be aligned with finance. I need to have something for my hiring managers so that they can interact with my team. I need to be able to provide air cover for my recruiting producers about whether or not they're even set up for success. Then I need a strategy to prioritize when they're not. And then I need to be able to communicate all of this out to my business. And so everyone needs some sort of communication plan that not only tells that individual what's going on, but aligns the whole team to have empathy for, one of the biggest measures of success for a recruiting leader is if you can get one manager to concede that another manager's priority is the priority. Do you know what I mean? Like that is like, if you can get them to understand by ROI to the business that, like, hey, marketing leader, the sales leader really needs these sales, so I have to deprioritize you. We could involve your hiring managers in the process. We could go get an agency, but this is the priority. And like, I understand because you've unified us to this, singular kind of operating plan. That to me is one of the measures of success, because you're participating in that executive conversation. You are treated as a peer, not a service provider. And while you are providing service, they're kind of understanding of how that service is being provided to them, with an understanding of like that, recruiting is capacity versus demand, and they have to work within those constraints. So that's kind of like, my take on recruiting leaders. Like, obviously you and I come from that background. That's what we're doing. For us, that's going to have then effects on hiring managers and executives, right? Sometimes executives are not going to like that, right? They're not going to like that they didn't get to an executive by understanding that they're the second priority. Do you know what I mean? So, you're going to have to work with the business plans put together for headcount execution by executives as well. But any other take on the recruiting side, or should we jump into these executives?
Yeah, I mean, I've been there. I've been, that person in the room who's, having to tell C-level no, they can't have the priority recs that they requested because something else is high priority, and it's not a fun environment to be in. As you say, these executives got there because they're very good at what they do. They're very persuasive, and very smart, and so you have to be well prepared. You have to have all the data. I think that's where really understanding the business needs is going to be really effective. Head of TA doesn't need to just understand how the recruiting function works. They need to understand how every aspect of the business that they're supporting works. But I think actually the big benefit is then going to whoever's the most senior person that's going to be making the decisions. And so if it's broken down by team, maybe it's the C-level who runs that department. If it's a small company, it's probably the CEO or CFO who's then going to be making the calls on the priority and understanding the business case for each role, so that you can actually represent it and actually create your stack rank recommendation going in. And once you've gone through several iterations of that, and that stack rank recommendation of your priority list matches how the CEO, the CFO would actually build their own rank, you become that much more trusted advisor then. And so the conversations go much more smoothly. You can actually, speak one-on-one with the other C-level and explain to them why that they have to wait another 3 months for their, high priority role as different parts of the business are coming in. And they understand, they get it. They might not like it, but at least they'll be supportive. And so I think there's huge value in really being proactive on that part, because it's going to save much more time down the road when you're getting a lot of pushback. And at that point, then, if you get pushback from the individual hiring manager, you've already gone, several layers above them and had buy-in. And so you can kind of just defer up their line of command. And it definitely saves a lot of time and heartache for the recruiting leader.
So one of the interesting experiences I've had, so after I was a TA leader internally, right, and I experienced things we had demand that exceeded capacity, but I couldn't get more recruiters, right? I've experienced as an individual, and I kind of like lived in that silo. After I did that experience, I consulted. So I did about 100 companies worth of either headcount or TA leader execution. So I'd go into a company, set up recruiting, and I'd give that executive team or the board for the investor like a report on how the recruiting team is set up for success or not, because it can block revenue or production. What I found of the 100 or so companies that I did, a significant percentage of them had an understanding that recruiting capacity was constrained, but bet on the financial savings from late hiring, because that was kind of the buffer built in. Was more common than I expected it to be. Now, it's been a while since I've consulted to know whether or not that's truly the case anymore, but I think it's important for TA leaders to know, like, as they interact with the business, particularly the executive team who are the persuasive trying to get their stuff done, is there's may be cultural incentives to lightning rod the TA leader to that conversation, and it's just out of your control. And I think if you are in that business, it's very difficult to know, like to like step outside yourself and look in and see if that's happening to you. But if you do recognize that as a pattern, like demand exceeds capacity, and I'm not necessarily getting the resources, there may be things beyond what is being shared with you that is there. That was kind of a key. I experienced it personally at some of the companies that I worked at, and then I saw it in a more broad sense. And I think I don't really have anything to say about it. I'm just mentioning it for the sake of mentioning it on the pod, maybe to get some sympathy. I need it. I need it. No, I don't know why I'm mentioning it, but I just know that exists, and it's very hard to build into a plan because if they were going to be transparent about it, they would just be transparent about it. So it's not like you could really call it out. But it's just when I'm dealing with executives and I have to bear the like, why aren't you getting it done? It's part of the reason I built the capacity demand forecast in Headcount 365. And maybe why some of those companies don't decide to buy the software is because they're like, we don't want this level of, oh, it's very obvious. But like for me, that's why I put it on the unicorn. You could download the one that I build in a spreadsheet. It's like, if I have you're asking for 100, I have 50. What do you want to do with the other 50? The more I can distribute the burden of that responsibility of like, the business wants this, the business can produce this, not Eric can produce this and it's Eric's fault, but this is how we're set up. I'm willing to make investments to increase my capacity or not. Like that's the type of stuff that if you can plug that into a simple model, download it on Unicorn, use Headcount 365, whatever, right? If you could plug that into a model and then use that as a talking point with your executives, you're now partnering with them and trying to get the business to solve a problem rather than, receive the I don't want to say blame, but you're definitely getting the pressure. But that's kind of one of those things that in my executive plan, I was always considering, all right, well, what environment I am, how does that executive perceive what I'm doing? And so, rounding out this last section of our podcast is like, what do the executives have to make a plan for? And one of them is the executives need to know, like, what do I need to do to produce this plan, right? And if you're relying on a recruiting team who's in that situation, you're going to need contingency plans. You're going to need like designated interviews. You're going to need hiring managers who can help review applications, whatever. But as an executive, you're making a plan for, what do I need to hit for my goals or my contribution to the overall business forecast? Does the recruiting team have the ability to fill it? And what resources from my team do I need to provide to loan to the process of recruiting, whether it be interviews, reviewing resumes, whatever, to ensure that I hit that plan? And so you're going to have this ideal, these are the roles I need by a given start date, but you're now making this execution strategy about like, all right, how probable is that? How do backfills how do backfills influence that? And then what resources do I need to provide to ensure that I hit that plan based on the priorities that I have as an executive? And so that's kind of like my initial take on kind of the executive business plan. What were your executives doing, whether it was at Wayfair or at your customers today? Like, how are they planning for their headcount execution for 2026?
Yeah, I think you touched on a lot of key points, and I think if I could bring you back to like one key point is understanding the constraint. Like, what is the constraint that you're managing to when you're creating that headcount plan? Is it a headcount cost constraint? I've worked in organizations where you have to stay within a certain budget. Is it recruiting capacity constraint where you're trying to grow as quickly as possible, but you only have a certain capacity on the recruiting team, and whether that's by design or just because the market's really hot and you can't hire more recruiters? Or is that the constraint of you're waiting for revenue to come in and you have to trickle down the kind of like hiring plan based on the need in the business and how that's growing over time? Like there's always a constraint that you're optimizing for. If you don't know the constraint, it's gonna be very hard to manage that plan. But as soon as you know that constraint and all the executives understand and are operating off that same constraint, I think then you're able to build a plan and execute more effectively from the TA leader's perspective, very quickly able to recommend that right prioritization list. And so I think that's going to be my kind of like key takeaway from I think everything we discussed today is know that constraint, understand how to optimize around that constraint, and I think you'll have a lot of success in actually bringing the kind of headcount plan to the business plan and actually having a really successful 2026.
Yeah, I think, just to conclude, put a nice little bow on it, right? Like the plan is built for 2026. You're getting to a place where it could be finalized. So what you're doing, the best practices that we're talking about here is understanding the plan that you have for next year and building headcount execution strategy against that plan. And so you're taking into context the previous year, you're trying to forecast what's actually going to happen from a business perspective. You're mapping it to the capacity demand of the recruiting team. You're adjusting for changes in the environment, whether it be the employment market or the AI tooling influence on headcount. And then each individual stakeholder has a way that they're going to go about executing this plan. And all of those should kind of roll up to this overarching business strategy. So for workforce planners, they're understanding the makeup of the org and whether or not they have the resources to meet the actual business demand from the forecast. The recruiting leaders are ensuring they have the recruiting capacity needed to meet the hiring demand and partnering with executives and hiring managers to ensure that we distribute the work correctly. And the finance team is trying to plan for whether or not that execution will be predictable, on time, on budget, so that they can forecast whether or not whether they can forecast the idea that what they thought was going to happen actually does happen, and they can adjust based on those probabilities. And so, the benefit of having a plan up front and unifying as a team not only will close out your year wonderfully because you're all aligned towards next year, you're going to have this way to operate that creates this partnership between every stakeholder, so that this kind of crazy cross-functional, everyone kind of selfishly has their own motive and their own stats that are associated with performance. Like obviously the recruiting team wants to hit their numbers, but they have to hit their numbers and it makes sense for the business, and it has to make sense for the business from a comp and from a revenue and standpoint, so that finance makes sense, so that the overarching business can hit their goals, can hit their funding, can hit their financing, can hit their sales goals, whatever. So I think in your mind, right? What are the benefits of having this headcount execution strategy figured out before going into 2026? Like what does a business get, and what does each individual stakeholder get from kind of going through this process now versus kind of ad hocing this execution for next year?
Yeah, I think the kind of the big takeaway, and it's probably a little like MBA-ish, it's like alignment. Alignment and synergy, two words that I don't use very often, but I think having alignment on the same plan and understanding how that synergizes across different parts of the organization is going to be really important, because then you have this 2026 plan in place. Head of TA, okay, this is what I need to do in order to execute these are all the kind of key milestones that we're going to hit over the course of the year. Head of revenues then going to do the same thing. Okay, this is my kind of sales hiring plan over the course of the year. These are the numbers we're going to hit. This is when we're going to release roles. The head of CS is then going to do the same thing. The IT team are going to understand how to onboard people, what demand they're going to face. The facilities team, if you're working in an office, like everyone needs to understand what is this plan going to be. And then how is that going to impact my organization, so that I can plan for success? And the earlier that headline plan gets released, the sooner the kind of next layer and the next layer and the next layer can get done, so that as you're rolling through 2026, everyone can kind of tie themselves back to this headcount plan and understands what's coming down the road, so that they're not surprised when all of a sudden 400 people show up at the door and they don't have laptops and they don't have desks, and there's no onboarding plan to go with them, because they were all hired in a rush. And then all of a sudden you don't have a manager to lead half of the people. And so you have to do this kind of like very quick kind of a pivoting within the organization, which doesn't create a good employee onboarding, doesn't really allow you to hit your numbers. And I think just that kind of understanding of how the high level plan is going to trickle down, and the importance of doing that early, and then having that kind of continuous communication going, to make sure that you're synergized across all the different parts of the organization.
You mentioned, I can't remember if it was off camera or not, but when you say synergy, you said these things, right? Triggers, ratios, and guardrails, right? So if everyone's aligned on, and I'm curious to know, like, I want you to explain what those are, right? But if this synergy means that we've all created operating plans that unify triggers, ratios, and guardrails, then we kind of have this idea of what make something happen or what stops something from happening. But can you go into a little bit more detail about triggers, ratios, and guardrails?
Yeah, so you're looking at how an organization is changing over time, and like what are the trigger points in which you need to then kind of release something new. So let's take sales hiring as an example. So you know that when you've got certain pipeline coverage, that the existing sales team is not actually going to be able to work that pipeline because they're at capacity. Well, you can probably predict when that pipeline is going to hit by looking at your marketing pipeline and understand how many leads you're getting at the very top of the funnel, and then look at the time duration for converting from kind of leads to qualified leads to active in the sales process to actually signing a contract and onboarding. And so if you understand that, you can figure out, okay, what is the trigger point in which we have enough leads at the top of the funnel to trigger that next hire? And then when that hire comes in, what is the then ratio of sales reps to sales managers that I need? And then when do I need to start thinking about when do we trigger that next sales manager hire? And then we look at the total number of customers. And so what is the ratio of customers to post-sales customer success? Or maybe you have a services part of the organization and a certain percentage of new customers are going to need this additional service capacity. You can actually start to model over time based on those kind of like trigger points. Okay, this is what it means for the rest of the organization. These are the ratios of people I need to build, but then also the kind of guardrails around, okay, well, what is an effective amount of onboarding that we can do each month, both from a customer perspective, but from an employee perspective as well? How do we make sure that we're not kind of really spiking demand in onboarding headcount and potentially losing some of the less quantifiable elements like culture of the organization because we've hired too many people too quickly, and all of a sudden we can't effectively onboard and coach and mentor these new people? And so, what are the kind of guardrails that you're going to put in so that you avoid those situations where you're kind of straying too far out of this kind of like zone of growth, which is sustainable, into something that's unsustainable. But having those in place, I think, up front so that everyone understands what they are is going to be really helpful, because then you can staff to the right onboarding ratio, you can staff to the right kind of like sales onboarding, you can actually build the plan more effectively when you have those three things in place. And thanks for reminding me. I thought I'd cover that on the podcast, but I think I did mention that beforehand. Yeah, I think, trigger points, ratios, guardrails. I think if you're going to take three takeaways from this conversation, if you can bake those into your plan, you're going to have a really successful 2026.
Yeah, I think there's just like if we combine them all into one situation we've all been in, is you have an eager hiring manager looking to add a new senior level person to their team because they've hired a bunch of ICs. And it's, if you didn't trigger enough IC, like if your ratio is 8 ICs to one manager and you've only hired 6, you didn't trigger that manager yet. And if you want to hire that thing above, that person above comp, then you have a guardrail of what that comp is, right? So like if everyone's aligned to these kind of key points in building it, I would say that, triggers, guardrails, and ratios are the 3 key points of like building the execution strategy. And so for each individual stakeholder, they're incorporating these philosophies into their plan. And by pre-stating them as a business, everyone you're not going to get like undue pressure. Kind of levels the playing field for each individual input to the headcount, workforce planning, TA process, HR process. It levels the playing field for how people interact, and that you kind of have some level of standard to hold someone accountable to, other than it being your individual decision. And so I think, we talked a lot about, how do you look at how those things played out in the history, and how do you forecast what's going to happen in the future. But having those 3 things kind of built into the execution plan of your headcount execution strategy is going to help you operate more efficiently, more effectively, and with a better, let's call it headcount culture, but a better vibe throughout the entire process, so that you're not fighting people on their opinion. You're kind of holding them to these kind of pillars of how you're building an execution strategy. So excellent way to close things out. I think, a lot of folks either listening to this the feedback I've gotten from folks listening to the podcast is there's things that we're bringing that they haven't experienced yet because they haven't worked in as many different companies or environments. And so by drawing that common line through all those things, I think it's a super interesting way to approach it. And until we just talked about it this hour, I don't know if I could have synthesized it as well up until this point. So I love talking about that type of stuff. Best episode we've recorded yet, with more to come. And I look forward to kind of talking with our special guest in a couple weeks and kind of closing out the year with the podcast. And like I said, we'll be back in January with a much more structured look at kind of headcount and headcount development as Chris and I kind of take this podcast to the next level. So great talking to you again. Great podcast. And, thanks for spending an hour with me every week.
That's fun.